What happens when a 5-year-old boy asks a question no world leader at the table dares to answer? And what if that one question changes everything? The helicopter touched down just after 4 p.m., its blades slicing the crisp mountain air before slowly winding down into silence. President Donald Trump stepped out onto the helipad at Camp David, the famed presidential retreat tucked deep in Maryland's Catoctin Mountains. The woods surrounding the compound stood tall and quiet, their early autumn leaves beginning to turn with the season. Trump paused a moment on the gravel path, breathing in the clean, pine-tinged air. This place always felt like a world apart from Washington. Less performative, less watched. No podiums, no press lines. Just stone cabins, wide trails, and the stillness that made even his thoughts sound louder. The weekend was meant to be a hybrid of business and breathing room. Alongside him were top national security advisors and 2 key civilian consultants, including Elon Musk, who had been invited to present updates on satellite defense systems and AI-controlled surveillance grids. Elon had arrived ahead of schedule, his son XAE-A12, or simply X, tagging quietly along. Unexpected but not uninvited, at just 5 years old, X was already known in quiet circles for his eerily perceptive nature and preference for observing over speaking. Trump had barely noticed him during the initial briefing, where Elon dove into relay network theory with all the intensity of a man narrating a chess match in another language. As aides carried bags to their cabins and Secret Service settled into perimeter positions, Trump made his way toward the dining lodge, where dinner would be held later that evening. On his way, he passed General Evelyn Shaw, a retired 4-star general and now national security advisor, exchanging a curt nod. A few steps behind her trailed Dr. Lionel Choi, an astrophysicist whose eyes never left his tablet screen. The circle of minds gathering at Camp David this weekend was sharp, seasoned, and confident. Some might say too confident. Trump didn't know it yet, but this carefully planned weekend, meant for geopolitical strategy and technological posturing, was about to be upended. Not by any threat briefing or cyber crisis, but by a single, innocent question from the quietest person in the room. The long oak table inside the Camp David dining lodge gleamed under the amber glow of the overhead chandeliers. Dinner had been carefully arranged, a blend of formal elegance and rustic simplicity. Roasted venison, root vegetables, and warm apple tart. Seated around the table were some of the most powerful minds in the world of defense, science, and government. President Trump occupied the central seat, flanked by General Evelyn Shaw, stoic and stone-faced, and Dr. Lionel Choi, already scribbling notes on a folded napkin. Across from them sat Elon Musk, animatedly discussing an upgrade to the orbital mesh system that would supposedly reduce satellite communication latency by 34%. His tone was rapid fire, eyes darting between data points only he could visualize. And next to him, perched silently on a booster seat, was XAE-A12, or X-clad, in a miniature navy blazer, his feet swinging beneath the chair. He hadn't touched much on his plate except the dinner rolls. His small fingers busied themselves, folding a napkin into an increasingly wrinkled triangle. No one had paid him much mind, aside from a few amused glances at the novelty of a child among titans. The conversation spun in tight circles: quantum encryption, machine learning predictive models, the weaponization of orbital drones. Everyone at the table spoke with practiced authority, layering jargon atop speculation like a fortress of certainty. President Trump listened, interjecting occasionally with questions that grounded the abstractions in political consequence, but mostly he let the experts speak. He was used to this kind of gathering: measured, technical, strategic, predictable. And then, like a pebble dropped into glass, X spoke. "What happens when people die?" he asked, his voice small but clear, breaking through the static of overlapping theories and clipped sentences. The table froze, not with shock, but with that particular adult discomfort that surfaces when a child's question cuts deeper than any policy ever could. For a beat, no one moved. Eyes flicked toward the boy, then away. General Shaw cleared her throat. Elon kept his eyes on his wine glass. Dr. Choi smiled nervously, and slowly the conversation picked back up, as if it hadn't happened. But Trump felt it. The silence after the question thudded in his chest. He glanced down the table at the boy, who was now refolding his napkin, head bowed, expression unreadable. The discussion moved on, but Trump didn't. Something small and sharp had just been planted, and it refused to let go. The conversation didn't recover, not really, though words resumed: satellite clusters, predictive threats, encrypted algorithms. There was a hollowness to them now, a quiet crack running through the center of the discussion. President Trump barely registered what was being said. His attention kept drifting to the boy at the far end of the table, small and still, refolding his napkin with the careful focus of someone trying to disappear. That one question, simple, raw, and brutally honest, hung in the air like unshed rain. What happens when people die? And no one had answered it. No one had even tried. It wasn't that the people at the table didn't hear it. They did. It was the way they all looked at X, then looked away. A few offered soft smiles or distracted nods, like you might give a child who interrupts a grown-up conversation. Others shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. Elon Musk had paused momentarily but said nothing, returning to his train of thought without acknowledging the boy's question. Trump had seen that move before, especially from powerful men who preferred certainty to vulnerability. The room had treated the question as a break in protocol, not a doorway into something deeper. And that silence, it hit Trump harder than he expected. He replayed the moment in his mind again and again as the dinner wrapped up. He watched X carefully, noting how the boy didn't ask again, didn't press for a response. Instead, he quietly accepted the silence, the way a child learns not to poke at the places that make adults uncomfortable. Trump had known that feeling himself. Years ago, as a young boy asking his mother questions about his older brother Fred, and being met with soft answers that never really said anything. It wasn't the absence of answers that hurt, it was the hesitation to even try. By the time the table had cleared and dessert was served, the boy was once again quiet, almost invisible. His napkin, now a limp, overfolded shape, lay beside his untouched plate, and Trump, sitting at the head of the table with a spoon in hand and a swirl of chocolate mousse before him, couldn't take a bite. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because something had shifted. Something small, yes, but something real. The boy had asked a question no one wanted to answer. And that, Trump realized, said more about the adults than it ever did about the child. Night had fully settled over Camp David, cloaking the retreat in a hush only broken by the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant rustle of wind through pines. President Trump had returned to his cabin, but rest never came. He sat for a long time in the leather armchair by the window, staring out into the dark. The boy's question looped in his mind, not because it was morbid, but because it was true, and no one had even tried to hold it. Eventually he stood, slipped on a coat, and stepped out into the cold, still air. No Secret Service trailed him. He knew these grounds too well and needed solitude more than protection. The winding stone path through the woods was lined with subtle ground lighting, leading toward the fire pit area near the tree line. As Trump approached, he noticed a small shape curled at the edge of the benches, a child-sized figure silhouetted against the embers of a fading fire. It was X, still dressed in his dinner blazer, legs tucked up, clutching something that looked like the crumpled remains of his napkin swan. The boy was motionless, eyes fixed on the dying glow. Trump paused several feet away, uncertain. A part of him, the political part, wanted to turn back, to let the boy's father or a staffer find him instead, but the other part, the quieter one that had been gnawing at him all night, told him to stay. Slowly he stepped closer, his shoes crunching softly over gravel and fallen leaves. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. X looked up, startled, then shrugged. "I snuck out," he said plainly. Trump offered a faint smile. "I do that sometimes too." There was no plan for what came next, no polished words, no strategy. Just a former businessman turned president, standing beside a boy too young to carry such questions alone. Trump sat at the opposite end of the bench, leaving space between them. The fire crackled faintly, casting flickering shadows around them, and for the first time that day, the president wasn't surrounded by cameras or advisors or experts, just one child, one question, and the quiet of the woods, waiting. The bench creaked softly beneath them, the air cool and still beneath the towering pines, scented faintly with earth and firewood. President Trump sat with his hands clasped loosely, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked on the last glowing coals in the fire pit, a fading warmth that echoed the quiet between them. Beside him, X didn't speak. The boy sat curled up, knees drawn to his chest, the wrinkled napkin from dinner still clutched in one hand like a charm or shield. Its shape no longer that of a swan but of something repeatedly folded, reimagined, and held onto, not for play but for comfort. The moonlight filtered through the trees, painting their faces in pale silver, stretching long shadows across the moss-covered ground. Trump was surprised by the stillness, not awkward, not heavy, just full. The kind of silence that didn't demand to be broken. It reminded him of sitting in his brother Fred's room after he passed, not speaking, just remembering. "You asked a question at dinner," Trump said finally, voice low, his gaze still on the embers. "A big one." The boy nodded, his small hands tightening slightly. "And nobody answered." Trump exhaled slowly through his nose. "No, they didn't. I'm sorry about that. I think you caught us all off guard." X turned to him, his voice delicate but steady. "Do grown-ups not like those kinds of questions?" Trump took a moment, then responded, "Some don't. Especially ones that don't have neat answers. We like to look smart, in control." "But you're not?" the boy asked, blinking at him. Trump offered a tired smile. "We're just older. That doesn't mean we know more about the important stuff. We just get better at pretending." The boy stared back at the fire. "I asked my dad once. He said people go back to the stars." He paused, but he said it really fast. Like he didn't mean it. Trump glanced up at the sky where the stars winked through branches swaying gently in the breeze. "Maybe he didn't know how to say what he really felt," he said. "It's hard to talk about things that scare us. Sometimes even to our kids." X hesitated, then, in the smallest voice, asked, "Do you know what happens when people die?" Trump was quiet, his jaw tightened slightly, his eyes normally guarded softened. "I've lost people," he said finally. "People I loved. Some slowly, some without warning, and I've been the one left behind trying to make sense of the silence, and I'll be honest with you, I still don't know what happens next." X stayed still, absorbing each word as if weighing its truth. "But," Trump added gently, "I believe something does happen, something kind. I believe love doesn't stop just because someone is gone." The boy turned toward him more fully now. "What if they forget me?" Trump looked into his eyes. "I don't think love works like that," he said. "I think real love, it moves forward. Even after someone is gone, what they gave you keeps going." "Like a star?" X asked softly. Trump smiled. "Exactly. When a star dies, it goes boom. But its light keeps traveling, through space, through time. People see it years later and still say, 'Look how bright that is.' That's what love does. It shows up when you least expect it, even in a quiet moment like this." X turned his eyes to the sky, the stars above now alive with new meaning. "I don't want to get big if it means I forget things." Trump felt something inside him stir. Deep and long asleep, he looked at the boy. Not just Elon Musk's son, not just a child, but a mirror of something he once was. Curious, scared, brave. "Then don't forget," Trump said, voice firmer now. "Keep asking, even if it makes people uncomfortable, especially then." And in that shared silence beneath the trees, something passed between them. Not answers, but understanding. And it was enough. The next morning, President Trump woke before the sun, the early light barely a whisper against the curtains of his cabin. He lay still in bed, the weight of the night before lingering, not like a burden, but like a stone dropped gently into still water. Something small, but impossible to ignore. The boy's words echoed in his mind. I don't want to get big if it means I forget things. Trump stared at the ceiling, unmoving, his hands folded across his chest. He had attended thousands of events, briefings, dinners, summits, but rarely had something as quiet as a child's question shaken him loose from habit. He rose slowly, not switching on the television, not checking his phone, no tie, no red power look, just a navy pullover and slacks. Downstairs, the coffee sat warm in a carafe, untouched by aides. He poured himself a cup, took it to the small study and sat in silence, watching the sky shift from slate to gold through the wide cabin window. On the table beside him lay a thick folder of policy briefings, schedules, and memos, but he didn't open it. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a blank notepad. He stared at the page for a long time before writing a single line. Sometimes a child's question is braver than a room full of answers. He didn't know what to do with that sentence yet, but he knew it mattered. He thought of his son, Barron. How long had it been since they had talked about anything real, not school or travel or headlines, but the questions that lived beneath the surface, the ones boys stop asking when no one seems to listen? He couldn't remember, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. Trump set the notepad down and leaned back, letting the warmth of the coffee do what it could to steady him. He had lived a life full of words, rallies, interviews, speeches. But silence, the kind that listens instead of fills, suddenly felt like something sacred. Today, he decided, would be different. Before the day filled with noise again, before the machines of politics roared back to life, he would make room for the one thing that had eluded him the most: presence. The late afternoon sun was casting long, amber shadows across the lawn when President Trump made his way toward the guest cabins where Barron was staying for the weekend. Aides had offered to escort him, but he'd waved them off. This wasn't official business. It wasn't even planned. It was a feeling, an ache, really, that had taken root since last night's conversation under the stars. The boy X had asked the question no one else dared, and Trump, for the first time in a long time, had listened instead of deflecting. That stillness had followed him, growing louder with each passing hour. It led him here, to his own son's door. He knocked softly. No answer. The door was cracked open slightly, so he eased it open and stepped inside. Barron was at his desk, hunched over a tablet, headphones on. He looked older than Trump remembered, taller, more closed off in that quiet teenage way. His room was meticulously clean, almost too neat, like it had been arranged to keep the world out. Trump cleared his throat. Barron turned, startled, and slipped off his headphones. "Hey," he said cautiously. "Hey," Trump echoed, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." "It's fine," Barron replied, setting his tablet aside. "You usually don't come in." "I know," Trump admitted. He sat on the edge of the bed, leaving space between them. "I met someone last night, Elon's kid." Barron raised an eyebrow. "X?" "Yeah, smart little guy. He asked a question at dinner about death, and no one answered him." Barron leaned back in his chair, heavy. Trump nodded. "It made me realize, I don't think we talk about things like that. Not you and me." Barron shrugged. "We don't really talk much, period." The words stung, but Trump didn't deflect. "You're right, and I'm sorry for that." He paused. "Do you ever think about stuff like that?" Barron hesitated. "Sometimes. I guess I just stopped asking." "Why?" "Because I didn't think anyone wanted to answer." Trump swallowed. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something fragile. "What if I asked you something now?" Barron looked at him, curious. "Like what?" Trump inhaled. "What scares you?" Barron looked away, then quietly said, "I'm scared I'll grow up and not be anything like you. That I'll want something different, something quiet, and that it'll disappoint you." Trump stood and walked over, placing a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "Then I'll find you," he said, "wherever you go. I'll find you, and I'll listen." Barron's eyes glistened. "Promise?" Trump nodded. "I promise." And for the first time in years, they didn't feel like father and son navigating roles. They just felt like two people finally meeting in the space between silence and understanding. 2 days later, with no press pool, no cameras, and no explanation, President Trump asked his detail for a single unmarked SUV and gave the driver an address he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. A small church tucked into the wooded hills of upstate New York, not far from the neighborhood where he grew up. The building was old now, its white paint chipped, the steeple slightly askew, but the red door at the top of the short stone steps was just as he remembered. He didn't come here to make a statement. He wasn't even sure why he came. Only that something inside him had been stirring since Camp David, and the quiet wasn't enough anymore. He needed to be somewhere that had known him before he was known. Inside, the sanctuary was empty. Dust hung in soft rays of sunlight pouring through stained glass windows. The wooden pews creaked gently as he sat in the fourth row, the one his mother used to favor. For a long time he said nothing, just sat there with his hands folded, breathing in the scent of old wood, wax, and time. He remembered sitting there as a boy, restless and bored during Sunday school, whispering questions to his mother during sermons. Where do people go when they die? Do angels get tired? Why can't I see God? She used to smile, tap his knee gently and say, "Close your eyes. Sometimes answers don't come in words." He had forgotten those moments, forgotten what it meant to ask without needing to perform. Footsteps echoed softly from the rear. An elderly woman entered the sanctuary and paused when she saw him. Thin, upright, and moving with a grace time hadn't yet stolen, she smiled faintly. "Mr. Trump," she said, voice warm, "you probably don't remember me." He stood. Recognition swept over him like a tide. "Mrs. Carnes," he breathed, "you were my Sunday school teacher." She nodded. "You always had more questions than I had time to answer." He chuckled, surprised by the emotion rising in his chest. "Still do." She joined him in the pew. "So, why now?" she asked gently. "A little boy asked me what happens when people die," he said quietly, "and I realized how long it's been since I asked anyone anything real." Mrs. Carnes smiled. "There's wisdom in answers, Donald, but there's grace in the questions we keep asking." And for the first time in years, he felt something like peace settle in his chest. Not from knowing, but from remembering that it's okay not to. Back at Camp David, the leaves had deepened into richer shades of gold, and the air carried that unmistakable stillness only early fall could bring. President Trump walked slowly through the garden path near the fire pit, his coat buttoned halfway, hands in his pockets. It was quieter than usual, no staff, no press briefings, no agenda. Just a short moment between meetings and headlines, reclaimed for something that had begun to feel more important. Ahead, perched again on the edge of the bench beneath the pines, was X. The boy was alone, tugging the hem of his sleeve and poking at a curled-up leaf on the ground. When he looked up and saw Trump approaching, he smiled shyly, not surprised, almost like he'd been expecting him. Trump sat beside him, mirroring the space they'd shared just days earlier. "You know," Trump said, "you've been on my mind a lot this week." X looked up. "Because I asked that thing?" "Exactly that," Trump said with a nod. "I didn't find an answer, but I found something else." The boy tilted his head. "What?" "That asking the question and not running from it is a kind of strength. Even grown-ups forget that." X nodded slowly. "I told my dad what you said, about the light. He didn't say much, but he listened." Trump smiled. "That's a start." The boy was quiet for a long moment. Then he whispered, "I'm glad I said it out loud." Trump looked at him, something settling in his expression. "Me too. You reminded me to talk to my own son, to remember things I hadn't let myself feel in a long time." X's voice was almost inaudible. "Do you think other grown-ups are scared too?" Trump glanced up at the sky, then back at him. "I think most of us are. We just hide it behind jobs, noise, or pretending to be busy." X looked down. "My dad's always busy." Trump nodded. "So was I, for a long time." And in that quiet clearing beneath the trees, it wasn't a president and a boy anymore, just two people, sitting in the not knowing together, and in doing so, they'd made a little more room for the truth. That evening, after the last meeting had ended and the final aide had left his cabin with a stack of briefing folders untouched, President Trump sat alone at his desk. In front of him was a slip of paper, plain unmarked, on which he'd written a single line in pencil. "Sometimes the bravest people are the ones who ask what no one else will." He stared at the words, then gently placed the paper into a small wooden frame and set it beside a photo of Barron, taken when he was 5, the same age as X. The boy who had asked about death hadn't just unsettled a conversation, he had reopened a door that Trump didn't even know had been sealed. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted. Those closest to Trump noticed it first. He listened longer, interrupted less, paused before answering. When Barron called, Trump stayed on the line longer than usual, sometimes saying nothing, just being there. It wasn't dramatic and it wasn't broadcasted, but it was real. What carried on wasn't the answer to the question, it was the space the question created. A space to feel, to remember, to speak, without needing to be right. A space where presence mattered more than certainty. And that, Trump realized, was the beginning of something lasting. The story reminds us that the most profound shifts in life don't always come from power, plans, or policies, but from moments of unexpected vulnerability. A simple question from a 5-year-old boy, "What happens when people die?" shakes a room of leaders into silence and awakens something long buried in the heart of a president. What unfolds isn't about finding answers, but about learning to sit in the discomfort of not knowing and realizing that silence isn't strength unless it holds space for truth. President Trump's journey is not one of dominance or strategy, but of humility and reflection. Through a child's courage to ask what others avoid, he reconnects with his own son, revisits the grief of his brother's death, and rediscovers the quiet wisdom of presence. The lesson is clear. Being strong doesn't mean always having the answer. It means being unafraid to listen, to feel, and to care when it matters most. This story teaches that legacy isn't built by the words we say in front of cameras, but by the questions we're willing to face behind closed doors. And sometimes, the smallest voices carry the light we've forgotten to follow.